SECfans.com. I'm going to do a little review show. Of course, I've got Husky Pup in the house. Got so much to talk about this week, not only in review, but in our preview of some upcoming games this weekend. But everybody's thinking we're going to talk about Alabama A&M, but what I want to talk about first is the one that really surprised us all this weekend, Auburn and Arkansas. Oh my goodness, have we not talked all year long about who is Auburn? We think they're good, we think they're not good, and then they just drop a 56-3 on us. So I want to get into this game. What we talked about last week was this was a show-me game for Auburn, and they certainly showed us something, especially against an Arkansas team that's gave some other good teams in the SEC either trouble or, coming off the win against Ole Miss. So let's talk about what happened. I know there weren't some matchups that were super favorable, but neither one of us saw a score like this. So I'm going to let you dive right into it. Take off.
We've been talking all year about where we thought Arkansas was, right? I know we have a lot of Arkansas fans that have listened to our show, partly because we were covering some games when we first got started.
Maybe not anymore, but...
Yeah, because at times we were kind of negative about it, or maybe more than just kind of negative. I never really bought into Arkansas as a team. Now, they kind of won me over the course of a few games, mostly due to Austin Allen and his arm, their ability to be creative on offense. And I thought Enos was doing an incredible job as an offensive coordinator. However, dating back to before and after the TCU game, both of us noted that there were signs that Arkansas had no defense. So
right.
The first thing I want to really note about the Auburn-Arkansas game is I was not surprised by Auburn's ability to move the football. We said, I think both of us last week, that we expected Auburn to win this game. We both expected Auburn to win this game because we felt like they were going to be able to run the ball at will. Auburn threw 12 passes in that ball game.
Right.
12 attempts. They only completed 7 passes in the entire game, and they scored 56 points. How did they do that? Well, they did it because they averaged 9.5 yards a carry. Because Cameron Petway...
it's funny about that, because I'm not going to get into the rushing numbers. I haven't looked at it yet, but this might be Auburn's one of their worst yards per attempt in terms of passing performances on the year. And if that's what it takes, a 7.4 instead of an 11.4 to get a 56-3 win, I think they'll take it every time.
Yeah, no, it was definitely one of their worst yards per attempt games in the season. They came in leading the conference in yards per attempt, and they didn't really do that this week. But it doesn't really matter when you're rushing for these kinds of just gaudy, silly numbers. We've talked quite a bit about the fact that Auburn's offense didn't quite know what it wanted to do. Gus Malzahn was trying to institute his system that he brought from Springfield, which is a much more pass-based offense than what we've ever really seen in a successful Auburn team. And sure enough, this year he handed the reins back to Lashley. I think he really did do so. Lashley has gone back to that Todd Graham-style power run game with zone read elements, and it's been extremely effective. I think you have to give a lot of credit to Auburn, their ability to Malzahn to realize that what he was doing really wasn't working and switch. I think you have to give credit to the fact that Auburn has really played with their offensive line all season, right? These are not the same 5 guys that started at the beginning of the year. Every time they mess with that and change it, they get a little bit more effective. And they've been able to create an identity as a run-first offense. But again, I really want to emphasize the fact that Arkansas hasn't really stopped anyone from rushing the ball all year. So I wasn't really expecting Auburn to get, probably anything less than 6 yards a carry would have really surprised me. But even this sort of gaudy number, to put it into kind of perspective, at 9.5 yards a carry, it's actually less than Texas A&M averaged. Texas A&M averaged 9.89 yards per carry. Everybody's going to start comparing Auburn to Alabama at this point. Alabama averaged 7.8 yards per carry. I also caution that Alabama was far more effective throwing the football than Auburn in that game, and had a lot more balance because Alabama actually threw early and then ran late when they were in garbage time. But every major offense that Arkansas has faced has really run the ball very successfully. Again, Ole Miss averaged almost 5 yards a carry, and Ole Miss really can't run the ball. This we'll probably talk to in a minute. And, all that said, what I'm saying there is I don't really take a whole lot from Auburn on offense. I mean, it was a very good performance. Don't get me wrong there. But the thing that stands out about this game is Arkansas, who had been an absolute frightening thunderstorm for everybody that played them, just got stopped cold in their tracks in this ball game offensively.
Right. And, just before we talk about Auburn's defensive performance, I do want to touch a little bit on, and I'd like your insight on a team in Auburn who rushed for 543 yards in this game. And, we're seeing now an Auburn team who has sort of said, screw all this messing around we did early in the season where we were trying to sort of concoct an offense and avoid our identity. Our identity is run it down your damn throat. And I think that's awesome for the teams that you can do it against. But what's really surprising to me is Arkansas knew exactly what Auburn was going to do. After a couple of drives, it was pretty obvious that Auburn had no interest in messing around with the passing game, and they still couldn't stop them. And not only could they not stop them, they couldn't slow them down. They couldn't slow down the backups. They couldn't slow down the water boy. So speak a little bit to how dominating of a rushing attack combined with how bad of a defense it takes to have a situation where even when you know they can't throw the ball, you still can't stop them from running.
Well, I think the way that happens, right, is if you're stacking the box and you get overwhelmed, you just kind of snowball. The defense can't get off the field. If they're running 8 yards a carry and boom, 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 yardage, the first down start accumulating. Your defense gets tired. They get worn down. Eventually they get demoralized. And this was definitely a game where Arkansas seemed to give up once they were down about 20 points. But something else I want to speak about a little bit schematically is the way that Auburn used motion jet sweeps in this ball game. There's a lot of Alabama fans that haven't been so used to the creativity that Auburn has seen offensively that are really complaining about how much Lane Kiffin is using jet sweeps and motions offensively. The reason you do that is what Auburn managed to do in this game. Auburn constantly got the ball to receivers on the perimeter, constantly ran in jet sweeps, reverses, and what they were doing is punishing Arkansas every time they really tried to load the box, meaning, you say load the box, and it can mean a lot of different things. And I've gotten to where I really don't like that term because it can mean 10 guys within 10 yards of the line of scrimmage. It might mean that you have 8 guys between the tackles and, in a 10-yard box, which is sort of the classical definition of it, around the tackles and depth. But if you're within the, between the tackles and deep, and a team is running these motions with fast receivers, you've got way too many guys all there in a clump, and if they can get the edge, they can get huge yardage. Cameron Petway had a good average in this game, 7.1 yards per carry. But Cameron Petway was not the reason that they absolutely went off. That was all the receivers that got touches. Eli Stove gets 3 carries. Cam Martin, I know some of these are running backs, but 7 carries. Stanton Truitt got 8 carries for 9.8 yards per carry. Sean White had 4 for over 15. And the 2 guys that you would think are the most classic runners that you'd expect to see in the game, Cameron Petway and probably John Franklin III, they had 7.1 and 5.6 respectively. Everybody else had over 9.8. So, some of these guys had over, Cam Martin had 11.4 yards per carry. So it was all that other window dressing stuff that made the Auburn offense so effective. And that's because even though it's technically running the ball every play, it's not even really creative. If you were that sophisticated in the way you get the ball at the perimeter and the way you attack different sorts of gaps horizontally across the line of scrimmage, you can kind of replace the passing game with a run game. So as much as, and I do think Arkansas was exhausted, I think that was most of it. Now, the flip side to this is you had to realize where the 2 teams were coming into this ball game, right? Arkansas played Alabama, Ole Miss, and Auburn all in a row. The first 2 games, Alabama and Ole Miss were at home for Arkansas, but the Auburn game was this away game. This was the 8th game in a row for Arkansas. They were very beat up. They're very tired. Allen has been standing in the pocket and delivering strikes, knowing he's going to get just absolutely pummeled day in and day out. And Auburn is coming off a bye week. And before the bye week, they had a big win against LSU. kind of an easy game against Louisiana Monroe, and then a blowout against Mississippi State. So this was a very rested Auburn team with extra time to prepare against an Arkansas team that just kind of went through murderer's row. And I think you have to factor that in a little bit to why the Arkansas performance was so poor.
I think you have to factor it in a little bit, but I think if you factor it in too much, it kind of takes away from what Auburn was actually able to accomplish. And I'm looking at an Arkansas team that's coming off of a pretty big high of beating Ole Miss and really looking to have something to play for. And I know they were beat up. And here's the thing, more than beat up is probably something you've spoken to all year is depth. And where Arkansas not only was coming off of 8 games in a row, no bye week, just played Ole Miss, that sort of thing. They don't have the depth to rotate in, so those games all in a row are doubly bad for an Arkansas where they may not be for an Alabama who was also playing 8 games in a row, and we'll talk to that in a minute. But 56-3, I think, speaks to something a little bit special, and a little bit more than just tired, just bad defense, just bad offense. I think we're starting to see Auburn identity. We're starting to see a little bit of separation and clarity for these teams in the West. And one particular play I want to talk about that speaks directly to Auburn's identity and what you exactly what you just discussed. I was actually talking to an Auburn friend of mine today who we were talking about this game. And I said the thing that epitomized this game for me was Stove's 78-yard run, the first score for Auburn, because it was the perfect combination of things that I think Auburn's lacked a little bit early in the year. It had a little bit of the motion, a little bit of the lateral. It also had lateral motion. It also had perfect run block fits with the fullback and the one wideout was on the left side, and then there was nothing but green for him. And that's something, and one more thing I'd like for you to touch on here is talk about just how devastating it can be for Auburn as an offense against their opponents if those fits are working and that timing is working, and just how devastating it can be for Auburn if those are just barely not there.
Anytime you run this sort of offense that is a gap-based, zone read, running game offense, you are really banking on having small windows open up where you can hit the line of scrimmage and accelerate. And the more you press as a defense to try to contain that, the less ability you have to react at the second level, right? Because if you have your safeties and you have your linebackers close to the line of scrimmage, you don't have anybody back there if you miss. So, teams play it different ways. Some teams try to stop you 4 or 5 yards, try to keep it contained, wait for you to make a mistake. Some teams get very aggressive, play the safeties down, and try to disrupt the offensively. But the more aggressive you are, also the more likely you are to give up a big play. In Auburn's case, in this game, Arkansas, again, and I keep stressing this because I think it's very important to remember the context, and this is why we bring things up objectively throughout the whole show. We've been pretty consistent in saying that Arkansas is really, really, really struggling defensively all year. And when you have that size gaps, the defense can't sit back and let you take play after play because you're going to get 9 yards of play. You're going to march down the field, and they're going to get exhausted. So they have to be aggressive. And then once those holes open up, those sweeps and motions, those off-tackle plays, there's no safety back there anymore to make a stop, right? There's nobody back there to stop it when, that receiver, number 12 for Auburn's just streaking down the field because there's nobody back there to make the tackle anymore. And Arkansas, for better or worse, under Bielema, has been very aggressive defensively. And when it works, when you're crashing the gaps, then you're making tackles in the backfield. You're stalling the offense. It looks like they can't do anything. They're going 3 and out. And occasionally you'll give up a huge play, right, where you have a bad run fit. But if it's working pretty well, you can look pretty good. The problem is if you ever run that style and it's not working and you aren't getting run fits, then you give up big plays fast. And to sort of turn it a little bit further, everything Auburn's doing here is about getting a guy in space. And if I have an extra step on a defender, right, if I get around tackle and I have a 2-yard wide hole, then I'm able to square my shoulders and explode through the hole. If that hole is a yard wide, then I probably have to try to squeeze through and I'm going to get contact. It's going to slow me down. And so little tiny differences in the amount of space you have make a tremendous impact on the ability of the offense to be productive, right? It's the difference between a linebacker getting a hand on you, slowing you down, and tackle for a 4-yard gain, and nobody getting a hand on you. You blow by the linebacker, and all of a sudden you score on a 78-yard run. So any sort of offense that predicated, basically any spread offense really, that is predicated on the short run, the run game laterally or the short passing game, tends to be greatly disproportionately affected by the defense's ability to close quickly. That's both a combination of ability to read and react. It's the speed of the defense, and it's the scheme of the defense. And you see any team like Auburn historically has greatly been impacted by the quality of defenses. Every time Auburn plays a lower opponent, Auburn almost always blows them out offensively, right? When they play Louisiana Monroe or a Samford or a Jacksonville State or whatever, they're going to put up a lot of points. And the reason is this style of offense exploits any failure you have to be in the right place in the right gap and turns that into a big plays quickly. However, it tends to get far less effective when the defenses get better. When Auburn had that phenomenal 2010 team, they got to the national championship against a very, very good Oregon team. All of a sudden, they didn't look great. And, Oregon had a very similar sort of scheme in that it was gap-based, and they couldn't really move the ball. Just last night, we saw one of the most powerful spread gap-based offenses in football, and that's Ohio State, really completely stall on Saturday. And the reason for that was they played a team that does good run fits and plays good aggressive defense, and they got completely shut down. So, yeah, it's a really disproportionate impact. The worse your defense gets, the better Auburn gets, and it gets good really, really quickly. So, I think there's a lot of identity here that's being established. I think they've gone to the power run, but I'm also not really surprised that they would be so much more effective against, say, Arkansas or Mississippi State than they were against Clemson early or LSU. Even though that was a victory, they didn't, they didn't score any touchdowns in that game, right? So none of that really is surprising to me. It is kind of a function of the defensive quality of the teams they're playing against.
So speaking of defensive quality, Auburn's defense has been pretty consistent this year, I think. And the question coming in this game was, Auburn hasn't really seen a good passing attack. You can say they saw Trevor Knight in Texas A&M, but he's been a 50% type passer. Makes him out of his mind throws, but then really be inconsistent. But I think they showed a little bit here. Yeah, again, I do think Austin Allen was super beat up. He's been getting just earholed every week. But I also am impressed that, not only did they hold them pretty well in the passing game, but the backups came in and didn't give up anything. And 56-3, I think this far into the season, I think it's time for us to concede that Auburn is, a top-tier defense, and it's so foreign to people who have followed this Auburn team for so long in that knowing that when you play Auburn, you worry that you're going to give up 35 points. Like, you're going to at least give up 30, but you might also be able to score 35 or 40. So it's a little bit of a pivot, and I think that's why it's taken some of us a little bit longer to come around to the fact that Auburn might win some games 20-17 or 15-13, something weird like that, because they've got a pretty good defense.
Yeah, no, and we'll probably get into this later, but working on the model already, it really backs this up. Auburn's just an all-around good defense this year. And the pass defense gets a lot of credit, but the run defense has been pretty stellar too. So, yeah, Auburn is doing everything you asked. They've only given up 60% passing in one game all season. That was Arkansas State. And kind of a nothing game where they weren't really trying very hard. Every other game, they've given up under 60% passing. Now, it's just so hard to get a read on them because of who they've played. Mississippi State, I think we have to concede, is bad. Louisiana Monroe's not very good. LSU, especially at the time, was terrible passing the football. Arkansas State actually did throw it pretty well in that game. And then you're pretty much left with Clemson, Texas A&M, and Arkansas. And of those three games, they lose two of them. The Clemson game was effective, but not very effective for Clemson. Texas A&M, they held right about to Texas A&M's per attempt average for the rest of the season, 6.2. They're averaging 6.4. And then Arkansas was really a coming out party, potentially. So I don't know. I think it's going to be really interesting the rest of the season to see if it continues, or to see if
we won't be able to see though. Like, who do they play the rest of the season? They've got Ole Miss next week, and we'll talk about that in our preview show. But Chad Kelly's looking worse and worse, and then they've got Vandy, UGA, Alabama, A&M, and then the last game's Alabama. So yeah, we might see the rest of the year, but we might not, because I don't know that they're going to face a legit offense until they play Alabama.
You know, you may have a point there. I think the Georgia game could be interesting. We'll discuss that later, I guess. But, Ole Miss is probably the premier passing attack for whatever shape they're in after this LSU game. And then Alabama isn't really firing on all cylinders as a passing game. So, you may be right there. But, we're probably about to discuss both those games, right? Ole Miss and Alabama, but neither one of those teams is looking particularly sharp in the passing game. So I'm not really – this is a problem for all the SEC West teams. It's really hard to gauge where their passing defenses are, because there's really only a couple passing games that are really clicking, and both of them, Arkansas and Ole Miss, have kind of derailed.